Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. The weather on the internet is good today, and all the pipes seem bright and clear, so thanks so much for joining us virtually. Before we really get started, you might be wondering, is this the breakout session you want to be in, or do you want to hop to another? Good questions to have. So here's a quick preview of what you'll learn, who we think this might best help, and who you're hearing from. So to begin the talk, we'll define and align on what kinds of bodies digital service teams exist within government and what purpose they exist for. This is the placements and missions segment. From there, the bulk of the presentation will explore the underlying principles and pros, cons that determine how you group people to achieve your outcomes. With this, we'll share some tips and things to consider when choosing a grouping principle. These first two sections we think will take about 30-ish minutes to cover. And during the presentation, you'll hear us saying probably quite a bit that no one size fits all. So please keep that in mind. Everything described today can be adapted for your specific context. And there's a lot of nuance when choosing your own structure. Because of all that nuance, we'll spend the remaining time in the session answering your questions so that we can explore the topic in a less academic box. And to do that, depending on how big your screen is, it's either on, if your screen is big, it's over on the right-hand side under the Sessions tab and in the QA section. And there's a little button at the bottom that says Ask a Question. So you'll be able to log questions there, and I think maybe upvote them as they come in too. So feel free to add things or add things into the chat if any of that gets too crazy. I think if your screen is smaller too, there's a little like up arrow with a line. You can click that and also get to those sections. So chances are, if you're at this conference and you're governors like us, there's something for you here. But these are the three audiences we prioritized. The first are civil servant founders who are determining how they might start or form a team around digital service competencies. The second group are folks that are already in the government digital service sphere and want to know how others are shaping their organizations or how you might restructure yours if something doesn't seem quite right or you want to shake things up a little bit. And the last group that we're thinking of are individuals that are partnering with digital service groups and want to get a better look of the machinery of their partners. So you might be wondering at this point, who are these jokers and why should I listen to them about digital service orgs and how they're shaped? It's a good question. And we'll introduce ourselves and the places we've adventured to get our experiences. To start, I am Jeff Mayer. I am the Director of Engineering at Bloomworks, which is a little digital services firm that works with government. We believe that better services start with people and not technology, and that's kind of how we go about our work. Before I wound up at Bloom, I was a little bit of a digital service nomad. I was a Code for America fellow back in 2014, jumped to the US Digital Service as one of its early members, working on things like Caseflow and vets.gov, which is now va.gov, and then did a little bit of consulting with states of Massachusetts and California before landing at the Canadian Digital Service. I'll pass to you, Andréane.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. Super happy to be here. My name is Andréane Trudeau, and I've been with the Canadian Digital Service for more than 2 years now, where I lead the consulting service. So I've always worked in the digital space, previously in the private sector, with different companies of different sizes and missions, where I had the opportunity to manage digital products for teams and setups that varied quite a lot. So thank you again for being here today with us, and I will pass it over to Colin.
Thanks, Andréane. My name is Colin MacArthur. I'm currently an adjunct professor of digital government at Università Bocconi in Milan, Italy. I've previously worked at the Canadian Digital Service with some of these folks, 18F, the US General Services Administration, and the good people at the Center for Civic Design. I actually started my career in the National Park Service. So Andréane started her career in private sector. I started my career in the federal government. But I feel like between all of us, we have seen all of the possible different ways to organize a digital team. And that's why I think we're all excited to be here. And with that, I'll pass to Lauren.
Thanks, Colin. I would echo that exactly. My name is Lauren Lockwood. I'm founder and CEO at Bloomworks. I'm excited to be working with Jeff again here. I previously founded the digital service team for the city of Boston back in 2014. And while I was there and since leaving there, have been really excited by the different forms that digital teams are taking at the state, local, and federal level. And so I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's something that's close to my heart, especially having done this previously in the private sector as well. So looking forward to going through these. And back to me. Thanks, Jeff. So, I think at the crux of this, there's no right way to structure a digital service effort. What works best, I guess, unsurprisingly, really depends on the context. So what we're going to be doing today is diving into the context and discuss the patterns that we've seen work well in different circumstances. So we're going to start by talking through the considerations for digital service teams based off of where they're housed within government and the primary mission that they serve. So the different placements, just to start us off here, the work that each team does and its ability to achieve its goals really depends on several things, including where the effort is housed within the organization. So to keep things simple, we're going to talk about 3 common placements for digital service efforts in government. The first is what we're calling a control center. So this is a group that's sort of close to authority, sometimes even physically located next to a mayor's office or a governor's office, and is really a place where you're sort of in close proximity to control. The second is a shared service team, and that's really a sort of central group that supports multiple agencies or departments. For example, when a group is housed within an IT department. The last placement that we'll be talking about, generally speaking, is a team that's directly embedded with a service. So within an agency or department supporting the service directly in-house. And with each of these, there are important factors to be aware of that help determine how successful the team will be. And so we want to talk more about that in the coming slides. But this is mostly just to set the foundation for now. So the second thing we wanted to talk about was the mission that a team might be starting with. So in addition to sort of where the digital team is housed within the organization, there's also the mission that the team is focused on in terms of the implications for what the team needs to meet its goals. So here too, we've simplified into 3 broad missions that we've seen. And just maybe a note before we dive in that missions can change over time, and also teams can have multiple missions. So what we're really focused on here is really the primary mission of each digital service team. So the first sort of mission that we'll be talking about is delivering a user-centered product or service. So to do this effectively, teams need a number of things. They need access to users and service infrastructure. That's the reason why you see, for example, many digital service teams housed within IT organizations. For example, I just mentioned Boston's digital service team. And that's really meant to minimize the obstacles between user research and the code base for a service. The second is needing to deliver those changes iteratively. Those teams will need measurable outcomes to do their work transparently. And then they also, really importantly, need reliable funding and term unlimited hiring. And those things are very closely related. If you're in this sort of virtual room with us, then you likely already know that services aren't set it and forget it. So to deliver iteratively on a service and adapt to meet user needs, teams really need to be able to rely on funding that is not short-term in nature and in-house staff that isn't tied to a specific administration. So as a result, we've seen that these teams are more successful typically when they are placed within sort of a shared service group or within a service directly. And when these teams don't have some of these things, then we've seen that they often struggle when they if they don't have one of these things that we just mentioned. So for example, COVID Alert Canada is an example of a service team that spanned across 3 different organizations. The first one being a control center, the second one being a service organization, and the third was focused on stakeholder engagement. So this situation made governance and decision-making processes more complex, which in turn impacted the implementation and delivery of the service. So there are a lot of examples of these types of teams. The ones we've listed here are just a few, but I'll pass it back to Jeff to go through a few more.
So rescue or fix is the next mission. This kind of mission is the one that gets overly glorified in a lot of the news, but is super important no less. There are many places in government where a service or program is not serving the people it should be helping. Sometimes this happens via a sudden failure like the US's healthcare.gov or Canada's Phoenix payroll system, but more often it's a slow, sustained failure like the disability claims backlog at the US Department of Veterans Affairs. The US Digital Service is a rescue fix example for these two US examples. And a more local example is the Massachusetts MBTA Customer Technology Department team that had to get service schedules and its website working when I think near apocalyptic amounts of snow slammed Boston in 2015. When failure happens, you might have to create a digital service team around rescue and fix to investigate and get things functioning again. This kind of mission often involves more aggressive tactics and probably should only be run from within a control center or a shared service because they require executive empowerment from those places to do things differently fast. They also need to streamline approvals, remove blockers, and clear people's schedules that require that kind of executive buy-in. When operating within this kind of mission, teams also need plenty of transparency to understand how something is operating today. You can't fix something if you don't understand it. This is important and can be really hard to set up, since folks that run the failing services may be afraid to share if they think they'll be penalized for that transparency. Lastly, rescue teams need expert practitioners that can zoom in from hands-on support to complex rescue strategies. And these people can be pretty hard to get, either because government IT salaries are lower than private industry or where they're at right now, but also because there's a lot of professional risk from attaching oneself to something that has a high risk of continued failure in a visible way. To best increase the odds of getting the appropriate people, you need the authority to hire experts with slightly different competencies and higher salaries than standard specialized government positions. And the last mission that we're going to go through today is change methods. So change methods oriented teams are all about changing ways of working. This commonly looks like getting service delivery teams to modify their norms to include talking to users, delivering iterative low-risk things, making the whole experience accessible, embracing DevOps in the cloud, or just truly understanding a process or journey end to end. They're also likely the teams with strong communications groups that write your favorite blog posts or tweet threads, since they need to be vocal to share these methods and build credibility. Think 18F or CDS partnerships in this case. And when I say CDS, I mean the Canadian Digital Service, not to diss the Colorado Digital Service. So these teams can best achieve their mission within control centers and shared services with executive support, both so that they can teach in more places and so that they have permission to do things that aren't yet part of a department's mainstream operating method. However, they also really need grassroots participation from the groups that they consult with. It's a really common mistake, and I've been a part of some of these common mistakes, of change methods teams that do the hands-on work for the group they consult with, only to find that their partner didn't learn how to use those same methods themselves. And then the group that you're working with winds up reverting back to their previous operations. It's been our experience that one of the most common cultural shifts that these teams tackle is getting government to more effectively listen to the people that it serves so that it can learn to meet their needs. It's also a common thread that government puts up a lot of real or perceived barriers to talking to people. So it's really critical that these teams are enabled with access to users. The last critical need that these teams need is hiring authority for experts, similar to rescue and fix. But members of these teams need experience to help meet people where they're at and need to be able to recognize and navigate the nuance of their partner's maturity level. Junior practitioners often had to jump in. This is not always the case, but they often jump in and see things in binaries simply because they haven't seen as much in their career yet. So there's a lot of like on-off, working, not working binaries. And more experienced folks, because they've seen a little bit more, can better spot areas that are or aren't likely or feasible to change. And then they can incrementally build up the capabilities of those that they support. Finally, there's one last kind of spicy need that we have on this slide, and that is term limits. We don't have this as a critical or must-have, but we list it to say that it's a consideration. It can be really helpful for getting the appropriate hiring authorities for experts, or to constantly refresh a team with new people and ideas. However, it does come with negative trade-offs, and depending on the arrangement, it can hurt the diversity of the team. And a good example of a change methods group that kind of balances this particular aspect is the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, which was in Philly a little bit, but is more well-known in its Boston incarnation. And so what they did was they had a hybrid approach where they had several permanent leadership positions that well served the team, but then they rotated in change agent for terms and specific projects to make sure they always had those new ideas and relevant experience. So those are the missions we've predominantly seen. As the talk goes on, think about where your current, future, or partner digital service team lives and what its mission or missions are. With that, Andréane, I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Jeff. So once you're clear on your why and on your placement and your respective ecosystem, you want to think about how you want to group people within your organization or how you're currently grouping them. So on the next slide, those are the 3 types of grouping principles that we have seen so far. So people might be grouped by priority, by expertise, or by product or service. It is worth noting, though, that these principles are not mutually exclusive, which means that your organization might be following more than one of those principles when assembling teams so that they can deliver on their mission. What we think here is important is to be clear on the dominant principle that is driving the people grouping in your organization. So grouping by priority is about assembling teams to work on what is urgent. People might be pulled away from their current project to work on more urgent projects. So we think that this grouping principle applies best to teams whose mission is to rescue or to fix. One of the advantages of this principle is that people can address top priorities quite quickly. This approach also assumes that people are changing projects or teams quite often, which leads them to be exposed to diverse situations or problem spaces, and then they can in turn benefit from this by expanding their horizons and by growing. On the other end, as much as people can grow from context switching in a sense, it can also take a toll on them. Context switching does increase cognitive load, and at times, team cohesion can deprecate, as well as the institutional knowledge of the team or product. The constant off and onboardings on teams can also negatively impact the overall quality of the work delivered by the team. All in all, these factors can lead to unsustainability and sometimes burnout for people. So grouping by expertise is the second principle, and it says it all. It is about assembling teams based on their expert knowledge and experience. So we've thought about engineering, design, research, or product management as examples for digital expertises here. We believe that this grouping principle applies best to teams whose mission is to rescue or to fix or change methods. So one of the advantages of this principle is that there is definitely consistency in how the expert work is delivered, given that experts will most likely have similar approaches or standards. In big organizations, most of the time, experts will benefit from the support of their communities of practices or managers, which will help them deepen their expertise. Plus, the hiring processes are usually clearly owned and robust. So looking at the disadvantages of this principle, the work objectives that span across different expertise or disciplines will sometimes have an unclear ownership. So people might end up focusing more on the objective of their own discipline or expertise instead of prioritizing the overall objective that their team or organization should deliver on. As much as consistency in the practice can be an advantage for this principle, a disadvantage is that sometimes affinity biases end up forming with people thinking extremely alike and undervaluing divergent thinking. So lastly, expertises that are in high demand in organizations can sometimes become bottlenecks in delivery work, given that they might not always be enough experts to supply to the demand. So for small organizations, the last principle is about having a Jane or a jack of all trades working on a product or a project. Whereas for big organizations, it is about having multidisciplinary teams, each focusing on a product or a service. We think that this grouping is best for delivering an actual product or service. So the overall advantage of this approach is that there is stability in teams with low rotation or movement in staff. Most of the time, this improves the cohesion and alignment within teams. Then this stability usually gets reflected in the focus that team members have by working on a specific problem area or scope that does not change often. This situation could be seen as the opposite of context switching. So teams grouped by product or service often build a strong institutional knowledge, and this shows in the overall product or service stability. Then when people are grouped based on this principle, there is also a risk for silos to crystallize in big organizations such as the government, especially when different areas of a product or a service are owned by different teams. So these teams become interdependent, and sometimes, or should we say most of the time, the onus is on them to figure out the dependencies that they have with one another, how they should be collaborating together. And at the end of the day, their overall ability to deliver is affected. As a result of that, organizations become less outcome focused and find themselves in a position where it is harder to think outside of the box. So this overall situation can also contribute to encouraging a culture of blame. Now, for teams that have focused on a single area for a very long time, a pattern of change resistance can sometimes emerge. And finally, when the funding or lifespan of the product or service is uncertain, there can be negative repercussions on the team morale or retention or the quality of the work delivered by people. Now, before turning it over to Lauren, we would like to ask you to pause and reflect on what your preference would be for your organization in terms of grouping principles. So thank you for pausing and reflecting with us, and then for using the chat to share your answer. And as answers are coming, Lauren will start presenting our next section. Thank you.
Thank you. And as those go into the chat, I'll continue on and then we'll look back at those. So as with team missions, the grouping principle for a team has implications for the care and feeding the team is going to need to create conditions for success. So much like the care instructions you get when you buy a plant, to, for example, guide you on the watering, temperature, sunlight needs of that plant, these tactics are patterns that we've seen that lead to the best outcomes for teams with different grouping principles. So much like, if you buy a cactus, you don't want to water it like an orchid or like a lily. You want to make sure that that you're operating with some contextual awareness for the type of team that you're working within. So when we were going through as a team and talking about the different examples we've experienced ourselves and ones that we've seen in practice, we felt that there were 4 broad categories of tactics that came up for each one. The first is hiring. So what kind of people do you need in order to do the work? The second was project process. So how do you determine who's working on what? The third is assigning work. How do you build a shared understanding on the team of who's doing what? And then the last is culture building. What values are most important to emphasize and reward? So while you might find yourself, another note as you're sort of going through this is that while you might find yourself in one place now, we've seen teams as grouping principles change over time. for example, as the team matures. So it's helpful to be aware of the ways the different teams' tactics might also need to evolve as the team does. And with that, I'll pass it over to Colin to talk through some of these different tactics.
Thanks, Lauren. So in my and our experience, different tactics help you and your organization move towards grouping yourself in different ways. Some of these things undoubtedly need sort of top-down power or authority to effect. So they need management buy-in or cooperation. But others of these things can kind of come from the bottom up. I mean, I was looking through the people who are in this, and I know there are a number of former colleagues of mine who were excellent at nudging the organization one way or another from the bottom up with some of these tactics. So keep that in mind. Even if you're not in a management role right now, these are things you can do to help push your organization in one way or another. So to just dive in, if you are trying to move towards grouping by priority, first of all, focus on hiring people based on whether they are adaptable and flexible with some good baseline cross-cutting knowledge. So that might mean hiring quote unquote digital service generalists instead of designers or engineers or people with particular disciplinary expertise. Second, if you want to move in this direction, you can also change how you assign work to people. Let people move themselves to the hottest burning fire, to the thing that really is the highest priority at the moment. But you have to be a little bit careful, because if priorities are changing quickly and people are moving from thing to thing to thing based on where the highest priority is, it can get pretty unclear who is doing what. So you need to create some kind of lightweight tool for transparency. Maybe that's a Google Doc that says who's working on what, or a Trello board, or GitHub issues with people assigned. Any of these tools can create a little transparency in this situation, but for the most part, you're trusting your flexible generalists to go from thing to thing. You can also set up your product management processes to encourage grouping based on priorities. So set simple standards for how you start projects, what the common tasks are, where people look to find documentation, etc. And then people can and will start moving from product to product, priority to priority. If you lower the friction of making those moves between products as priorities change, often that will happen naturally. And finally, if you want to move in this direction, you really have to celebrate people who embody these values, who really show how to be adaptable and perhaps, to use an overly used word, agile, who are a bit agile in your organization. You have to reward context switching and really celebrate that idea. It's worth noting that this is not the kind of organization that some people want to work in, and that's perfectly okay. If you find yourself not wanting to work in an organization like this, you might want to take a different approach to grouping, like expertise. So in my experience, many organizations trying to kind of stabilize and mature come to this way of grouping their people. You really start to hire people, and this is, I think, the primary way to move in this direction, is hiring people for their particular expertise. So hire a designer, an engineer, a product manager, and maybe even people more specialized, a delivery manager and a product manager, a user experience designer and a graphic designer. But you hire people who are really passionate about their forms of work and really excited to do that within your context. You can also change how you assign work to encourage this kind of grouping. So try creating archetypes for how many people of what roles a typical product team involves. Then you're kind of making the statement, okay, on a product team, there are these different roles, and different people of different expertises belong on a team, and that's what we believe is important. Now, the challenge there is making sure your teams are balanced, right? You need to make sure that as you're encouraging teams to have a dedicated designer, an engineer, or product manager, you have the right numbers of those people compared to each other. But again, creating these archetypes can really help. you can also move in this direction by clarifying what each role does on a product team. So when you're looking at your project processes, you can say, okay, now that we're trying to be really focused on expertise, we need to support people in doing that by clarifying, okay, what exactly does each group of people do? The reality is that many people are very excited and expert in their own discipline, but they are not necessarily as good at stitching their disciplines together on an interdisciplinary team. And so that's why it becomes important to do this work of defining roles clearly. And finally, from a culture perspective, if you want to be grouping by expertise, you really want to reward people who focus on their craft. You want to celebrate people who are really trying to become better designers or better researchers and so on. And sort of focusing on that often emphasizes stability and commitment in the long term. All right, can I just have a quick tech check? Can people hear me? Okay, excellent. Just got a few messages that other folks couldn't hear me. Sorry about the interruption. All right, so fantastic. That's if you want to group by expertise. But in the end, people sometimes find that grouping by expertise feels like it misses the bigger picture of why everyone's at work. It's kind of, we're not just here to be good designers or researchers or engineers. We're here for a mission, and we're here for particular products. And so you can shift to grouping people by product or services. And again, that starts with hiring based on the relevant skills for a particular product or service or mission. So think hiring a DevOps engineer to improve the security of cloud.gov instead of hiring just a generalist engineer and expecting them to fill in various places. The trick here, when it comes to assigning work, is to avoid moving people between products much. So that encourages people to continue grouping based on products and not on other dimensions. Remember, if you hire people to work on a particular product or mission, that's probably what they'll be most excited to do in your org. And the wheels kind of start to come off the bus if you start moving people between the products. And so if you find yourself needing to move folks between products all the time, this might not actually be the right primary grouping approach for you. Something to think about. Ultimately, you'll move toward grouping by product or mission if you define clear and shared outcomes for each product. You aren't hiring people to do what their discipline says is right. They need a sort of North Star to bring their work together. And without that, it's easy for mission-specific teams to become less focused. And with that, it kind of becomes natural to group yourself according to what's the one thing that we're all working on right now. So again, I just want to emphasize that these are kind of lessons learned from my and our experiences, the speakers' experiences. And we've worked in many different places, but we haven't worked in all the places. We definitely all have our own biases and tilts. So these are just a few ideas for things to think about as you think about how you want to nudge your organization into one structure or the other. Thinking about these principles and these tactics can be a helpful way of thinking through a tough problem. With that, I'll give it back to Lauren.
Thanks, Colin. So that was a lot that we just went through. And just to reiterate what Colin mentioned earlier in the chat, we will share a link to these slides later. Because there's so many different ways of modeling and organizing digital service teams, there are so many factors to keep in mind. When we started talking together as a group about it, it can feel almost overwhelming. It's hard to even know where to begin to talk about digital service teams. So our hope today was basically to put some basic frameworks together to help start that conversation and help us draw lines between the different patterns and ways of organizing teams. So we put together what we thought, at least for us, was a helpful picture in terms of just looking at what we've talked about here today. So to summarize, we started by talking about placements. So where a digital service effort is housed within government and how that impacts what a team can do. Then we talked about the mission. Are you rescuing a service? Are you changing culture? And how the team's needs might differ based off of that. And then the third thing we talked about was grouping principle. So are you organized around a product, around a team's skill sets? And how does that change the tactics needed to meet the team's goals? And then finally, the different tactics to keep in mind as you're looking at the grouping principle for the team. So this map is one that we found helpful. The lines represent patterns that we've talked about today in terms of what seems to work best under different models. And the types of interactions that we've seen the most success with. And with that, I'll pass it back to Colin to close this out.
Thanks, Lauren. So just one final note. How you make these decisions about how you group people in your organizations, it has real world consequences. In the words of Aaron Snow, show me your org chart and I'll tell you your strategy. You can write all the strategy documents and value statements and ways of working that you want, but how you structure your organization will drive what you accomplish. And so if you take away anything from this talk, it is go forth and structure your organization deliberately. Don't do it by accident. Make it a deliberate choice. And we're excited to talk more about that with all of you. And so with that, we'll take your questions. Thanks again. Fantastic. Jeff, are you wanting to MC questions, or do you want me to start with that?
If you want to kick things off, Colin, I'm just shifting windows around to find the questions.
Fantastic. I see one question in the chat that we'll start with, and then we'll definitely go to the Q&A section of the hop-in. So everybody, please definitely ask questions in the Q&A area if you can. So Francesca asks, do you see, do you see a clear owner for this work? How do you staff for this, and any thoughts on how to build shared ownership / buy-in for this across teams? I mean, I think that we all, I think I can speak for many people on this call that we did this talk because we felt like this was all a role that we had to play at some point, but didn't have a lot of resources or time to do. I will let other people from our speakers answer. I'll just say, I think this is a particularly important thing for leaders to pay really close attention to. So I think sometimes it's easy to think of this as an afterthought or something you inherit from your parent organization if you're somewhere else. But like, I think that it really matters how you group people. I think that has a huge impact on the psychology of people's work. And so I think that leaders of all forms and orgs really need to think about that closely. Other thoughts, Jeff, Andréane, or Lauren?
We'll move on then to the next question. So for anybody following along, I'm just looking over at the questions in Hopin's little session tab, and then there's a sub tab called Q&A, and it gives you the ability to add questions and upvote. So I'm just I'm pulling off the questions based on what has the most votes. So the first question is, what kinds of signs could we look out for to suggest a mismatch between organizational structure and the organizational mission? And that's from Allison Link. Anybody want to take that one? It's a good question. Maybe I can start off with one and then pass to my colleagues. One of the signs that I oftentimes see when there's a mismatch between the organization structure and the mission is when your structure doesn't seem like it's incentivizing the things that you want to accomplish. So like maybe an example here is that you're trying to build a critical like product or service that maybe it like delivers unemployment insurance, or maybe like in the Canadian digital service context, it's Notify that helps other government services send emails and text message notifications. But your structure doesn't prioritize necessarily like delivering those things. Like people are trying to become experts within their discipline, but like aren't all on the same page, or don't have management that aligns to the outcomes, but aligns to discipline idealism. Also, like this is kind of tangent to structure, but also like if your funding for your structure is not permanent, but it's a permanent service that needs to exist, then people that want to use that service could be in a precarious place if funding falls off. But I'll pass to someone else for other symptoms of things not going well.
I just say quickly that to me, whenever I've encountered an organization not fulfilling its stated mission, one of the first places I look is the organizational structure or grouping principles, depending on the size of the organization. So especially in big orgs, that tends to be one of the first places to look. So maybe the answer to your question is like, well, if the mission isn't really working out right now, this is one of the first places to start.
If I can add, I think that also it would be helpful to look at the number of escalations that you receive as a management team. That could be like a thing to watch out for when you're assessing if how you're grouping your people is actually like fitting your mission and your placement. Yeah.
I would just add too that like I found it helpful to ask the people who are working as part of the team what the most difficult parts of the ideally some of the most difficult parts of a, for example, a service designer's job should be service design, not bureaucratic hurdles. And so I feel like there are a lot of things we can do. I think when an organization is or when a team is organized properly or aligned nicely to its mission, I feel like we can do a better job at protecting people within the team from some of the bureaucratic hurdles that they may have to go through. And so I think that at least on as part of the teams that I've been through has been a factor in looking at how the team is organized and how well we're able to support the mission based off of that.
And maybe right before we move to the next question, wanted to plus one a thing Andrienne said in a way that maybe you can action exactly what she said about escalation. So Andrienne and I have been part of a reorg in the past, and one of the things that we did that kind of helped us understand that our structure at the time was not well serving our mission was that we made a chart or a graph that showed how many people needed to be involved to make the most common decisions. And I can't remember what the number was, but like we found out that it took like 70 people to make like basic decisions, and that's why we were having trouble accomplishing some of the things that our group was doing. And so being able to like think about like what's the thing that I do the most, or what's the thing that my organization needs to do the most or think about in order to move forward on a mission, and then figure out like mathematically or like anecdotally how many people that is, and that can be a really good sign. Okay, we'll move to the next question. And so the next one is an anonymous question, but it is around how you might approach bringing contractors or agencies into these structures. And so in the asker's question, they're very limited in making in-house hires, so they have a lot of like contract folks added into their mix.
I have a quick hot take, and then I will pass it to other people. I just love this question because it's one that I've so often faced. I think that there's another grouping principle often at hand in government teams, which is group by employment status, like contractor or not. And I have personally never found that to be a super productive way to structure and group people. I understand the reasons for it. I think that people are often really concerned about being clear, about lines between government employees and contractors. But I think making that the predominant organizing principle of your organization, especially if you're really reliant on contractors, is kind of hazardous. So the places I've seen work the best with contracted staff use one of the other principles that we described, but incorporate both their government and their non-government staff into that. Of course, they're remembering, you know, who is contracted to do what, and they're careful about the boundaries of contracts, but they're not using the grouping principle, you know, like contractor or not. They're using one of these other approaches and including everybody, regardless of their kind of employment terms in that. I think that's a somewhat controversial take, so I will take any flack on that, but I just wanted to share it.
Lauren, I'm super curious on your take, having both run government teams with contractors and now running a contracting company.
Yeah, I also, like Colin, have strong views here. I feel like there are, I mean, when I worked in Boston, our team was very small. So we worked a lot with contractors and vendors for different things. I think the key was to be extremely intentional about how we used other outside organizations. And I think it was really hard to have sort of a connection point for contractors or outside agencies without having somebody in-house who is good at managing their time and sort of unblocking the blockers for them and things like that, which is, I think, very different than just like a PMO. I think it's really more about a sense of accountability and ownership within government. And so I prioritized those types of roles in-house. So for example, a designer, but a designer that was also good at managing a team of other designers that we might not be able to bring in-house. And so I have found that model to be really helpful because I did think that scoping those engagements and putting some bounds around how you work with them was extremely difficult.
Okay, great. Thank you. So many good questions. We'll move to the next one from Elizabeth, who says that my organization has struggled with the role of management/supervisors in a product service grouping. We currently have managers, supervisors for expertise grouping, but they've felt really disengaged and unsure in their role as we've moved to product service grouping. What supervisory models would you recommend for a product service grouping? And Andrea, I feel like you'll have a good answer for this one.
I'm looking at Colin nodding, so please chime in, Colin. I'm like wrapping my head around that. This very great question. So having managers, supervisors, they have felt really disengaged. Yeah. It's like, it's a matter of like balancing, right? Like with your role, like tying back your role to also the mission and looking at like Lauren was saying, like, what are the strengths and the skills that you have, right? So that you can design roles or these supervisory roles around that mission and around like the skills and strengths that you've identified on your teams. So like, again, it's like extremely depending on context, but yeah, it's a tricky one, right? It needs to go back to the context, to the mission, and then to the skills and the strengths that your people have and that they also want to develop. Yeah. So please, Jeff, if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I was looking at Colin. It looked like he might have jumped in too, but happy to go. Yeah, no, this is a really really hard one. And so my answer comes with my own self-bias. It might not be the right fit for your organization, but I haven't felt that the expertise grouping is super wonderful in the product service, just because you want to align the incentives to have your manager like want the outcome more than they want the idealism of that discipline. But I think more importantly is what you talked about, Elizabeth, in your question, where the managers feel kind of lost because they don't know what's going on day to day for the people that they manage. And so I think like my personal recommendation would be to move management closer to the actual product service. Or if your product service is really big, onto the project teams themselves. I think the trade-off there is that your management tends to shift around more, so people might not have the same manager for as long as they do in a more matrixed kind of model. But it does mean that there's somebody that feels pretty attached both to their manager, but the managers also feel pretty attached to what all their people are doing and the people themselves. And they have more context and I think can be stronger coaches and managers in those situations. Like my very biased and perhaps spicy recommendation is to figure out if there are ways that you can attach management closer to your product or projects.
Yeah, maybe just to sum up for Elizabeth, I think that a number of people on this call have been involved in a large organizational restructuring from expertise-specific management to product or service-specific management. And really the reason for that was the problem that you're describing, Elizabeth. I wouldn't say our managers were disengaged. They were great people and great experts, but it became too complicated and unwieldy. And so what I really think you have to do is ask some kind of hard questions in your organization about like, are our managers in the right places and do they have the right spans of responsibility? If not, it can be time to make a manager for each product instead of a manager for each discipline. But I don't think anybody here will pretend that's an easy discussion. Great question.
Okay. The next question from Jessica is, how can orgs move between placements, missions, or grouping principles, minimize the disruption and stress to the people that are already working within the existing structures? I could probably start here, but curious on others' take. It's difficult when you're moving between these placements, missions, or groupings. Why the transition is happening. They might also not understand what the transition will do and how that changes their career or how they're measured as an employee. And so Andrian and I went through, we didn't have a placement change, but we did have a kind of a grouping principle change. And so one of the things that we had to do with the org was kind of co-create what the transition would look like and why it was happening and keep people informed. But we also had to do it iteratively. So like not everything changed at once because that can be really disruptive, particularly because there's a really big, when you're changing your principle, you're also changing how things get prioritized, but you're also changing who owns and is responsible for what. And so being able to give people a lot of heads up on what their new roles and responsibilities look like, what their escalation routes are, and when that's happening and which parts are happening when is really, really important.
I can echo this for sure. I think that like in terms of like principles, like predictability, openness, and clear communications, like when you combine this, then like I think that like it can put people like in a safe and good place to actually like expect that change and also be bought in that change, if I can say. And as Jeff said, going for an iterative approach also provide like help us understand like the things that change from the former structure with like those adjustment or tweaks that you're gradually or progressively rolling out, and then also sharing those insights to the team. So so that has been extremely helpful for us.
Okay, we only have 5 more minutes, so maybe we can just sneak in one last question and then wrap up so that we end on time. So the last question is from Cheney, which is, how do you recommend pushing back against we have to go through HR to get this new structure approved, and that will take 6 to 12 months?
I can take a first quick swing at that. I mean, I think to some extent that really depends on the particular bureaucracy you are in and like how meaningful job titles and roles are and the consequences those have for people. What I would just say is that my personal experience has been that if the formal org chart, the one that is dictated by the government agency, becomes very different than the working reality, like you end up with these sort of like two versions of the org, like one on paper and one in less clear space, and that can be okay. But it's often worth doing the work of actually, like, at least to the extent possible, restructuring things a little bit on paper as well. So I don't know. I think that may be a little bit of a traditionalist answer for the civic tech space, but I think it's often worth doing some of the work. The other tip I would just have there is that in general, HR people are most concerned about issues that will create more work for them. And so if you manage your reorgs very well, they often have fewer concerns over time.
Thanks, Colin. With that, we're going to wrap up since we only have a couple minutes, and these are all such great questions, and I'd love to have more time to go through them, but I think we probably won't have time to get to the next few. So what I did do, though, is I put up our last slide that has our names and email addresses. So if we didn't get to your question, like, feel free to reach out. Would love to provide an answer. I know that we saw in the chat that some of the slides were kind of blurry as we were going through them. So we'll I think probably those of us on Twitter more regularly will post a link on our Twitter feed, and I think CFA will have the recording for this, and we'll make sure to get them a link that they can include in the recording notes so that folks can see it better. With that, thank you so much for popping in, and good luck designing your orgs.